So thank you all for coming and welcome to this evening's I3 seminar. Tonight we're focusing on extreme conditions and their effects on fertility and fertility treatments. And this is why I've put myself in the extreme environment of a volcano tonight. So we'll be talking about high-level sports activity, endurance sports, high altitudes, low temperatures, and occupational demands of working in extreme conditions. I'm joined by my colleague in the US, Staci Wyatt, who's a senior embryologist with over 20 years of experience in the field. She's also a consultant assisting in sales, development, and implementation for fertility EHR, and an avid interest in fitness and wellness. I'm also joined by Dr. Jen Barcroft, obstetrics and gynecology specialist, who has a deep involvement in reproductive medicine at a London teaching hospital. Her PhD at Imperial College explores machine learning in diagnostic gynecology. She's also a sports enthusiast and has recently conquered the Meurig 312, which is about a 200-mile bike ride in a day, and also the Marmot Grand Alps, which is one of the most brutal cycling rides. And she's also part of the clinical team at Fertility Health. So over to you, Staci.
Thank you, Lyndon. Lyndon is an accomplished athlete competing in over 30 marathons, 6 Ironman races, and more, with 30 years in the field of IVF. He brings extensive expertise from 6 IVF clinics, including 6 years as a senior embryologist and Harvard instructor at Brigham and Women's Hospital. He has been a national assessor for clinical embryologists and a regular speaker at conferences. And welcome, Lyndon, as well. So before we start our chat, I do just want to remind everybody on the webinar, if you have questions, please place them in the Q&A section of the webinar, not the chat. And the certificate of attendance for this session will be sent out in a few days post-session. So how do extreme conditions, endurance sports, and even jobs impact fertility? Is there an estrogen advantage to extreme conditions? What is the female athlete triad? And what's going on with men in the gym and fertility awareness? These are all topics that we're going to dive into today. And now over to you, Jen.
Thanks, Staci. So we're super excited about this session, and I'm joined by fantastic moderators, Staci and Lyndon, and we're also here with an expert panelist team. So we have Felicity, Devey, who is a registered dietitian and sport and exercise nutritionist who supports elite athletes' health globally. Her experience spans altitude, warm environments, international travel, and major sporting events. We also have Pippa Woolven, who is a former Great Britain athlete and a positive psychology coach, who brings a wealth of experience as a champion and a founder of Project Red S, which explores the intersection of sport and psychology. Handing over to you, Lyndon.
Thank you. So I think we'll begin with our first speaker, who's a very good friend of mine from over many years. Shaun Rogers. He's actually from Birmingham, and from people who know and love Peaky Blinders, he's from the home of Peaky Blinders. So we actually have a Peaky Blinder giving us a talk for 20 minutes. He's worked in all areas of IVF since 1992. He's the UK and Ireland clinical application scientist for Ifigeneia, the clinical operations director of Mojo Fertility, and the clinical support for Logix Pharma, Baby Inc., and Andrology Solutions. He's recently founded the IVF logistics and consultancy companies, and in his spare time, he's also a visiting researcher at the University of Kent. So over to you, Shaun.
My main affiliation is with Ifigeneia Biomedics. But I'm just here talking today because of my patient interaction with Mojo Fertility and Baby Inc., talking to patients, having conversations about their results, and relating that to their fertility journey and their life and occupations. And also, maybe more importantly, my time with Logix Pharma, looking at DNA fragmentation results and relating those results to Guy's reasons for presenting for fertility investigations and diagnostic workups. So today I'm going to discuss risky occupations. As I said, we'll touch a little bit on endurance activities, but not go into great depth, because that'll be covered in the other speakers. Meurig and Ifigeneia will talk a great more detail with that, and look at the general health implications where people are participating in risky occupations and difficult conditions. Relate these jobs to fertility issues, and touch throughout when non-risky occupations have the similar issues and have some crossover. Okay, so what is a risky occupation? I think you think of the police, the army, healthcare workers in difficult times, the emergency services. When we ask the lawyers what is a risky occupation, I would say a risky occupation is a job that exposes employees to some type of major risk. This or these risks can cause injury, illness, or other harm. These occupations require staff to exercise caution while working, employ safe measures and procedures, utilize specialist equipment and training. Dangerous positions may involve heavy machinery, harmful substances, severe weather, and other dangers. So that's what the lawyers think. What are the statistics surrounding that? The European Union engage with all of their member states and perform research to be aware of which occupations causes the greatest risk. The most significant measure of risk is identifying whether there are fatalities that occur in different occupations. We can rank those occupations where fertility has occurred and look at the percentages of reported fatal accidents can occur. So what would we expect to be the most risky occupations? And there are the ones that we would expect: construction workers, manufacturing, people dealing with heavy machinery, transportation and storage. Transportation, anyone who drives, that's always a big risk. Agriculture and forestry and fishery. Agriculture, especially coming into contact with hazardous materials. Fishery, coming into contact with difficult weather conditions, working in strenuous situations. Might be surprised to see number 5, wholesale and retail, or number 6, administrative support or service activities. Now, we have a large number of fatalities caused by falls, trips, and slips. I don't think we'll consider those risky occupations, but they are the major cause of fatalities that we see. So risky occupations have falls, physical injuries, falling objects, heavy machinery. Those machinery has hazards when you're operating those, working in high altitudes or low altitudes, deep sea diving, working while there's extreme weathers and having the risk of electric shock. I think we need to think about hazardous chemical exposure, hazardous material exposure, heat exhaustion, and overexertion as key issues and key problems that make an occupation risky. So that's the thoughts in Europe. Let's have a look a little bit closer to home for me. The Health and Safety Executive is a agency that will measure the risk in working environments and in everyday life. Each company would need to report any problems, any workplace accidents via a system called RIDDLE. It's reporting of injuries, disease, and dangerous occurrences. And that's ruled by those RIDDLE regulations. That's the last R's of regulations. When we assess the reasons for fatalities in the UK, we could see a similar theme: construction work, agriculture and forestry, manufacturing, again, that wholesale and retail. Let's look at in the US and look at the US Bureau of Labor Statistics that puts together the figures to assess how many fatalities per 100,000 workers come across. And that gives a measure of which occupations cause the greatest risks there. Again, similar fields, similar themes: agriculture, construction, fishing, aircraft pilots, flight engineers, those who come in contact with chemicals and dangerous hazards. So similar themes. But is that our major consideration? Fatalities. Fatalities are unfortunately the tip of the iceberg of occupational health issues. Really, we should be considering, and especially as reproductive biologists, clinicians, embryologists, the people that are going to be presenting to us are those who survive those issues that occur in occupational situations. So let's look at the incidence of non-fatal occupational risks. The top of the list there is exposure to harmful substances or environments, and overexertion and bodily reactions to exposure of extreme items. So those extreme items could be electric shocks, radiation and noise, high temperatures, air and water and pressure changes. But really, the exposure for harmful substances is the leading risk to workers that will leave them injured, ill for over 3 days, or 3 to 7 days, but still able to, still able to survive. We need to think about why the exposure to harmful substances and environments is the highest issue. In 2020, we're all aware of the COVID crisis that we suffered, and that increased the percentage of people that was exposed to a dangerous contamination there from COVID, a dangerous issue from a microbial source. But that increased the numbers to up to 28% and pushed up exposure to harmful substances to the top of the list. But even so, exposure to chemicals, hazardous chemicals in the workplace has always been a real risk, and did, even before COVID, present a high proportion of those that would suffer from a workplace issue and a workplace problem and a workplace illness. So an agency associated to the United Nations, the International Labour Organization, assesses workplace issues, and they have a statement that suggests that we've long known that there was issues with hazardous chemicals, and we need to make sure that we monitor their use and monitor people that work in these conditions, because they are continually exposed to risk and harm. And that harm is a potential risk to our general health. Chemical exposure can contribute to health disorders such as cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, obesity, cancer, endocrine disruption, and reproductive diseases. And that's why we're here today, and we're here always for these meetings to think about other implications that relate to our reproductive work. Chemicals associated to the use of manufacture of household items have increased a large amount over the last decades, the last few decades, 200-fold in those last decades. Bisphenols, phthalates, azotrides, biphenyls, and other nasty agents can be associated to reproductive disease. And here is a study that has highlighted 10 key characteristic chemicals that cause an issue for female reproductive toxicity, usually in the role of endocrine disruptors. And endocrine disruptors have an issue both to men and women by interrupting the normal function of the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, influencing LH, luteinizing hormone, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and androgen receptors. We can see disruptions and reduction in those hormone levels and the interaction of those hormones, which then can then influence spermatogenesis and oogenesis in a negative way. When we think about the effects of endocrine inhibitors and endocrine disruptors, we often think about women, but have a similar effect on men. But again, thinking about issues in the occupational frame, in looking at different occupations and different situations when you're working, exertion and working for long hours, endurance in your working shift can cause additional issues. And we see that when we look at non-fatal injuries and body reactions in working in conditions that cause a real challenge. So with people operating for long periods of time, or a short, sharp shock of handling heavy items or operating heavy machinery, we can see problems occurring with their health and occurring with their reproductive health. Heavy work and heavy exertion can be associated with reduced sperm parameters. Men with other health problems appear to have subfertility when they engage in hard working environments and hard working occupations. Those who are working with large vibrations, noise, heat, and prolonged sitting, you would expect to have reduced semen quality. There's been numbers of studies that suggest that having prolonged sitting periods you'd expect to have poor semen quality, but that's not always the case. So we need to keep an open mind when we are considering the impact and effect of people that are working in difficult conditions. And some studies also have found no relationship with comorbidities and poor semen samples. That's when we look at studies that have looked at men and women that work in shift work in the chemical industry, long distance lorry drivers, in the manufacturing industry, those that are in extreme heat, such as welders, and those that are confined in a manufacturing situation where they're sitting for prolonged time periods. All risky occupations should be considered difficult and have the impact and having an impact on female and male reproduction and having impact on general health. But tough conditions can be subtle. Shift work is a tough condition. In our modern society, where we have a need for two incomes, the social economic pressure. We find that men and women are having to consider taking on shift work, maybe even combining a main job with an additional job, which they can fit in different shift patterns. Is that a challenge to us? Well, yes, it is. Studies, there's been a very large study in Australia that looked at night shift workers, especially women night shift workers. If you're working in unsocial hours or modifying our daily activities to work during the night and sleep during the day, we have the potential to having a shift to our brain's circadian patterns. So the body is synchronized to a day and night pattern, and the portion of the brain that manages that is the circadian clock. Our bodily functions are guided by this clock. Digestion, our heart rate, our blood pressure, our brain activity is all falls into a pattern. And a disrupted circadian clock can cause an increase in issues due to our digestion not working as we should do. So obesity can occur. If we're not having a fully rested time period, then our moods can be changed. There's other issues such as blood sugar control and some evidence of increased certain types of cancer risk, as well as gastrointestinal problems that may occur. In the study, it looked at 100,000, over 100,000 women. They saw that a high percentage of those that had night shift workers, had a higher need for IVF. A meta-analysis on different types of occupations, looking at night shift workers in particular, showed that there was an increase in fertility rates required by women that underwent occupations that required a night shift work. So this shows that if you don't have a very extreme condition or extreme situation, even in your everyday life, even in something that would be viewed as a straightforward occupation, there could be a impact if we are not working in a standard and common garden manner. What other non-fatal risks should we be concerned about? As I said, tough conditions can be subtle. We would expect that a firefighter in a challenging, hot environment, or that a lorry driver that drives for long distances and then is expected to engage in large levels of manual handling. Those that work in toxic environments, in the chemical industry, that are challenged by using heavy machinery that causes a large amount of exertion and physical energy, they are all facing a risky occupation, a risk and an occupational hazard. Exertion in a short term can lead to dizziness, soreness, hotness, sweatiness. That can cause human errors, because exertion will cause the person not to be able to concentrate on the task at hand. We can find that musculoskeletal disorders can also be associated with large exertion in the workplace. Additional exertion can lead to low levels of oxygen. Low levels of oxygen would also cause issues for bodily function and working performance. Hypoxia is an extreme issue and has been linked to a large number of bodily dysfunctions. In a reproductive reproductive framework, hypoxia can have an effect on spermatogenesis. It can have an influence on sperm function. If we have a high percentage of, if we have a high incidence of reactive oxygen species generation in the form of hydrogen peroxide, that hydrogen peroxide will break down to the damaging hydroxyl groups, and the hydroxyl groups can have the potential to increase DNA damage. Although the mechanisms for germ cell apoptosis is not well known, can lead to, there's been studies that show that there's an increase in germ cell apoptosis. And we know that oxygen-free radicals increase lipid peroxidation and hence reduce the function of sperm and will inhibit the chance of pregnancy and normal sperm function. In our lists that was generated when we looked at extreme and challenging occupations, it was quite surprising not to see the military as one of those risky occupations that led to many fatalities. I would assume that we would have a safer situation in the military due to their use of very extreme and rigorous procedures to ensure that they are protected. Safety equipment will be adopted at all times, and rigorous control of individuals while they're performing their functions and working activities will ensure that they are safe during their activities. But they are coming in contact to endurance situations. They are in stressful situations, and it's obvious that being in the military is a risky occupation. When we also think about the military, we think about war. In war situations, are those conditions lead to challenges and problems. Obviously, the fatality issue and the injury issue is obvious. Maybe not so obvious would there be an impact on fertility? Studies that looked at individuals that have been in a combat area, either a combatant or a non-combatant, may also have an influence from that war situation. We know that female combatants and non-female combatants have menstrual irregularities during conflict. We also have evidence that suggests that some fertility can be an issue with females in a war environment. Despite the problems that can be caused by menstrual irregularities and stress and subfertility, there doesn't seem to be an evidence of long-term impact. And after they get out of the stress situations and out of the combat situations, it appears that there is no long-term impact on infertility, and they're able to have a child after they remove themselves from that, or the cessation of those issues have occurred. Again, studies that looked at male combatants and non-combatants have seen reduced sperm parameters, a hormone imbalance. Again, there's been evidence there's no long-term impact, and male soldiers and men that have been in a combat area have not seen a long-term impact and suffered fertility issues after that as it occurred. The reasons for this are unclear. But we must attribute the difficult and challenging environment that they're in as the reasons for causing the problems. So to move on to our next speaker, let's look back at what I've been speaking about over the last 15 minutes. Non-fatal accidents and mishaps are significant occupational hazards. Chemical exposure is challenging to individuals, and substandard environments can cause long-term health problems. Those non-hazardous exposure to harsh work environments can have negative impacts on male and female infertility, as well as those health problems, and contribute one of those major health problems. Having to work in difficult environments may be due to occupational status, and that and other factors may have an impact on the need to select a difficult occupation. Strenuous prolonged activity can reduce reproductive function. As we can see, the increase of reactive oxygen species. Some advantages can be seen. There's a suggestion that there's an estrogen an impact of estrogen, an estrogen advantage for female soldiers who don't lose fat and can maintain their muscle integrity. But our next speakers will talk about that in great detail. And the most important thing that we must consider is that not all studies agree. Therefore, we need to research more and take a measured approach when we're discussing with couples that present with subfertility and state that they have a difficult occupation. We need to think about the multifactorial nature of subfertility in these workers and be appreciative that they face physical stress and work in difficult conditions.
Thank you, Shaun. That was brilliant. What a great overview of perhaps some hidden stresses that we aren't necessarily aware of. I guess one of this is really highlighted some of the areas that we need to explore as clinicians and in the embryology side, but also patient-facing clinicians and thinking about possible stresses that can be associated with subfertility, but also related to miscarriage. And I think particularly close to my heart is this discussion about circadian rhythm, which is a really difficult one and also brings in the other kind of clear stressor is stress related to occupations. And I guess there is clearly an overlap between subfertility and miscarriage, and we know that night shift workers are associated with a higher risk of having a miscarriage in similar levels to the risk when they're having high levels of caffeine. So I guess one of the questions really is about, it's good to know about this, but what can we do about this for patients, in that we highlight something that's causing subfertility, but then are you asking them to change their occupation because that will help them or may not help them conceive?
Well, it's especially the night work and the shift working percentage of workers. It's always very difficult to be able to confront your employee and state, you know, this has got the potential to be having an impact on my health. We need to look at my working patterns. But it's something that we'd have to guide our patients and individuals that we come into contact to do. It's not unrealistic to have an employer consider changing a work shift pattern. And there's evidence out there and research has been performed to show that if you can move a shift pattern to, you know, some portion of the daytime or some portions of the early evening, mix up that working pattern to enable you to have some parts of the month where you are more of a conventional kind of a working 9 to 5 day, that will have an impact on your health.
Yeah,
Maintaining continual shift work, okay, that's something that you'd have to do if that is only the strict contract that you're engaged in. But if there is a moving shift pattern, then having a conversation with your employee to try and modify that would be the important thing to do.
That's brilliant. And I think it just raises the point that we should all ask the question about what people do for a work and consider it as a possible cause for subfertility and pregnancy loss. There are many things that we could talk about, Shaun, but I think we will leave the other question and answers until later on in the session. So please, if you have any questions, we'll go through those a little bit later on in the session. I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, which is Dr. Meurig Gallagher, who has completed a master's and a PhD in applied mathematics. He then has moved on from that into reproduction, and he's now currently working as an assistant professor at the University of Birmingham School of Medicine, Mathematics and Computer Science. Meurig has integrated mathematical modeling and software with experiments and qualitative methods to create new diagnostics, treatments, and understanding for male infertility. Over to you, Meurig.
Thank you very much for that lovely invite and for the invite to talk to you all tonight. I'm going to be talking to you about something slightly different from Shaun, don't know why I said Paul, about gym lifestyle factors specifically, but thinking from the male perspective, male reproductive health. And rather than thinking primarily about the science and what underlies it, really thinking about what are people doing and what do they think about? What are the societal aspects that are going on under the hood? A slight confession before I start. Really, most of this work was done by a student of mine, Alice Newman-Sanders, so she really deserves all the credit for what I'm going to be talking about tonight. And when I spoke to my guide daughter this afternoon and told her what I was going to be doing tonight, she threw me this nice little piglet to go along with the talk, so I thought I'd share that with you all. I don't have any conflicts of interest really that apply to anything we're going to talk about tonight. So why should we care about men infertility? I mean, you're all here because you're interested in IVF, you're interested in the world of fertility and subfertility. You know that men are important, but actually that doesn't necessarily translate to wider society, certainly not in the UK, and definitely around the world as well. Views are still quite entrenched about the lack of importance of men necessarily. And it's only really recently we've been starting to think more about men and the role that the man plays, and really how we've become to understand that male factors impact everything. It's not just chance of conception, it's not just can a couple get pregnant, but it's fetal development, it's miscarriage, it's even later health of the child. So really we need to be thinking more holistically about the men within this path. Actually, what I'm talking to you about today is something aside from the main focus of a lot of what we do in Birmingham, where what we're really spending our day-to-day job on is trying to work out new ways to assess sperm particularly, and create diagnostics and therapies for the male partner. I could talk about this for hours and hours. That's a subject for another day, but just thought I'd drop this reference in and a link to our FAST software package where we track sperm tails as they swim to really get an insight into what's going on. Arguably, as I've said, we currently don't really care about sperm, and that's just really sad. I mean, there's a global crisis in male reproductive health, according to the Male Reproductive Health Initiative. They pointed out lack of funding, the fact that we have no early diagnosis or treatment for male reproductive factors, and particularly there's a really distinct lack of societal awareness and education. That's something that we're going to focus on in the next 20 minutes for this talk. Just to point out, the references I put in there will all be on the slide at the end, and this is recorded, so don't worry if you're not seeing them pop up on the screen. Infertility worldwide is often just seen as a female issue, and that really, unfairly places a burden onto women, an emotional burden, but also a physical burden. You know, we have lots of invasive treatments that have quite poor chances of success. By not bringing men in and treating men in the same way, we're really making this system much more uneven than it can be and really should be. Not just physical, but actually when it comes to distress as well, I think we're letting down men on that point. So we have quite a good understanding about this distress of female infertility. Quite a lot of research has been done on it, and it's well understood. But actually for males, there's still quite a source of stigma around infertility. They don't like to talk about it. And there's a lot of complicated feelings there about how men react to their fertility and how they feel like they're letting themselves and or their partner down. But at the same time, in many societies, the concepts of virility, strength, the ability to have a child are seen as really important characteristics of masculinity. So there's kind of a disconnect there in how we think about fertility and how we react to things that are kind of fertility adjacent. And actually a key thing about everything that I'm talking to you today is that the evidence points towards a gap in the awareness of male infertility risk factors, things that can affect fertility, not just men aren't thinking about, but women aren't thinking about either. And we're going to explore a bit of that over the next few slides. So we know that there's a lot of lifestyle factors that impact sperm quality. And we know that a lot of them, you know, as Shaun has pointed out in the previous talk, are things that we might kind of naively be aware on that relate to health. Things like weight, poor diet, stress, smoking, excess alcohol consumption, you know, problematic shift patterns. All of these things can have big impacts on sperm quality. We also know that gym use, so going to the gym regularly, is on the rise, certainly in the UK. And we know that there's some quite conflicting evidence about how different types of gym use or extreme exercise can affect your fertility, whether it's weightlifting, cycling, or physical strength. But some studies have shown they may or may not, depending on the activity, have some significant impacts on sperm quality. And supporting this kind of rise in culture, there's arisen this really big market for gym supplementation, in particular protein. So really we're thinking about whey protein and soy-based proteins. I know if I go down to the shop now in the supermarket, where there didn't used to be 5 years ago, there's a whole section devoted to different sorts of gym supplementation. So people are really interested in taking these things. And actually, to put some numbers to it, in 2016, the market intelligence agency Mintel found that just 12% of people and 23% of men aged 16 to 24 were taking some sort of supplements for exercise. So I'd like to just note those numbers in your head, because when we look at the numbers in our survey later on, obviously from last year, you'll really see a big increase there. But observationally, we know that there is some sort of suspicion around this and about the impacts that they might have. So talking to many fertility professionals, they tell me that when they have a man who presents with a poor semen analysis and is taking a lot of these supplements, they will advise stopping supplementation, and they often see that this improves semen parameters. So there is some awareness here about the way that these things that people are taking could, if not have been proven to, affect sperm quality. So what do we know? What is settled in terms of the science? Well, actually, not a lot. Really, a lot of the science regarding protein supplementation is far from settled. There's little robust evidence in the form of randomized control trials, for example. But there are small studies that have found potentially significant effects. So one small pilot study of 20 subfertile men that regularly take protein supplementation showed that after they stopped for a period of 2 weeks, and regular assessments after that of their sperm quality, shows at the end of the trial a 2.6% times increase in their sperm concentration versus their baseline while they were taking the supplement. That's a really, really big change. Again, small study, not large-scale RCT. But these sorts of small studies do raise some sorts of concerns regarding the high concentrations of estrogens and plant equivalents, so phytoestrogens, in these whey and soy protein supplements, and the potential effects that they may have on male reproductive parameters. Those are human studies. A lot of studies on these sorts of things are done in animals. They've shown different things. So again, the studies in mice have shown no significant effect of whey protein. In rodents, diet with increased soy phytoestrogen reduced serum testosterone and prostate rate. And in a different mouse study, a high phytoestrogen diet led to a 20% reduction in litter size and a 25% decrease in epididymal sperm count. So you might look at this and say, well, it's not that the science isn't settled, it's the fact that there's no effect here because things are just bouncing around zero and actually there's no real thing to find. But we don't really believe that's the case because actually the problem is that these are very, very difficult things to test. So we know in a population, the spread of normal baseline sperm parameters is huge. We know that different people respond to things differently, particularly from different genetic backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds. An RCT that looks at one supplement is not really the same if it's a very controlled environment as the reality of what we see in men in day-to-day, where they may be taking more than one thing or a cocktail of things, or supplements that aren't well controlled in terms of their composition. So actually there really is a lot here that we need to look at, and we need to still understand about settling the science and seeing what the effects potentially are. But trying to settle the science here isn't really the point of this talk or the study that I'm talking about. Really, we were interested in the awareness. So not just are people thinking about the supplement potential effect, but also are gym-going men thinking about their fertility at all? Is there any understanding that male reproductive health is a thing that we should be thinking about? So we decided to investigate awareness of these potential associations between male reproductive health and protein supplementation. I put the asterisk there because it says we decided. Really, what I mean is that Alice decided. And one thing we were really interested in is trying to assess whether there's differences between the awareness coming from men and women that we surveyed in the study. Finally, what I will talk about towards the end is the fact that we had a desire to not just get some kind of statistical data on the spread of the questions that we were asking, but actually trying to extract some of the personal voices of the participants in our study to understand not just their thoughts regarding male reproductive health, but how they would access information if they're interested in accessing information, how they would, what sources of information they'd look to try and understand these effects, or not try and understand these effects if it's something that they weren't interested in at all. Those are the sorts of questions that we were trying to answer with this study. And if you want to read the study, again, this reference will be on the last page of my talk, but it's published in RBMO this month. The PubMed ID is just there. So we did two things in this study. We created a questionnaire, which is the first thing I'm going to talk about, and then we also did a number of focus groups. So we designed this questionnaire to address the questions that we've talked about. It was an anonymous questionnaire that was filled in online. People accessed it via a QR code. It was voluntary. Obviously, participants could leave the survey at any time for any reason. We had an information screen at the start so they could give informed consent and they knew what they were going to be reading about. And we pointed them to some extra resources if anything that they read during the questionnaire brought up any feelings that they wanted to explore further. The questionnaire was divided into three main sections. So general information, Then section 2, where we asked for, depending on whether participants identified as male or female, information on male lifestyles or female lifestyles, which were essentially the same questions, but just targeted slightly differently so we could compare them. Participants that identified as other, we didn't ask section 2. And then we asked awareness of male reproductive health and a set of questions there. So going forward, this was the demographics of the people that filled out the study. So we got about 150 respondents, which was really good, actually. It was far better than we were expecting for this sort of study. And that the questionnaire was only open for a matter of weeks. I think it was 3 or 4 weeks total. So we got some quite good uptake here. Roughly equal gender split, which was really nice for the analysis. And unsurprisingly, given this was a project conducted at the University of Birmingham, the majority of people responding were in that 18 to 25 bracket. In the top right panel, you'll see the average amount of exercise that they undertook per week, kind of centered around 3 to 5, 6 to 9 hours a week. Obviously, we had some people on the far end that were doing a lot of exercise, some people that were doing little, but a nice spread again. Mostly being done in a mixture of gym and non-gym, but again, a good spread there. So panel E here in the bottom middle was really the first kind of bit of shock that I saw when it came to analysing the results, to actually really see the scale of usage that goes on. So if you think back to that Mintel study of 12% of people, 20% of men in that age bracket, now we're up to 79% of men, 56% of women. So it's by far the majority. In the case of men, we asked, it was the extreme majority of people are taking some sort of protein supplement use to supplement their gym going. Interestingly, though, only one person in the whole study admitted to taking anabolic steroids. So there really is a marker of people thinking protein supplements okay, anabolic steroids less so. The first set of results I'm going to show you about the questions were about awareness or differences in awareness between men and women. So in each pair here, we've got 4 questions, the men on the left, the female responses on the right. So first question, I know that some form of high intensity exercise, such as weightlifting and cycling, have allegedly been associated with negative effects on male infertility. There was a significant difference between the respondents from the men and the women. Women were much more likely to have some form of awareness about the effects of high intensity exercise on male infertility than the men. A similar sort of pattern in the question about protein shakes. So we asked them whether I know that protein shakes or supplements may have a negative effect either upon my or on, depending on whether they're male or female, sperm quality. Again, female on the whole were more likely to be neutral or agree that they did know this. A handful of men felt that they strongly agreed, but actually overall, many more men didn't have this awareness at all. Interestingly, the questions about anabolic steroids. So question 3, I know that anabolic steroid supplements, e.g. testosterone, can have a negative impact on male reproductive health. And question 4, I know that some protein supplements have been found to be contaminated. Those 2 questions, contaminated with anabolic steroids. Those 2 questions had very little difference between men and women. Very few people had an awareness of steroid contamination. The vast majority of people had an awareness that the anabolic steroid supplements can have a negative impact. So that's really an interesting finding here, is that the notion that anabolic steroids can have an impact on male fertility is something that has really cut through. I suspect if you went back 30 years or so, you wouldn't get the same picture. There was a clear, strong educational push to really raise this level of awareness and really hammer home that anabolic steroids can be bad for you. And that's really still persists in young people today. So that's really interesting. We move on to just thinking about the men's attitudes now. So we asked them a set of questions based around what their attitudes and understanding of fertility was. So this first set of questions, A1, I've thought about my fertility before. A2, I would be curious to know my personal fertility or my personal sperm count. And A3, my personal fertility is important to me. I would want the possibility of my own genetic children. So you'll see those last two questions about curiosity and whether their fertility is important. The vast majority of men agree or strongly agree that those things are important to them. So fertility does matter to these young men, but they just, on the whole, don't think about it. There is a noticeable shift to the left in this graph that is statistically significant, where it's kind of 50-50 whether men have or have not thought about their fertility before. And that's quite an interesting finding, because it means that this is a population where if you can get to them, I think there is the potential to educate and the potential to really inform and help them understand more about themselves and about their fertility. It's just not something that's kind of coming to the forefront of their mind every day, unlike maybe if you've seen the recent news articles, the Roman Empire, which apparently men think about on average something like 5 times a day. About consequences then. So we asked them 4 questions about consequences to see where they stood on these sorts of things. So B1, I've thought about the consequences of gym routines and supplements on male fertility. B2, at the moment, I think that the benefits of gym and supplements are more important to me than fertility. B3, I would alter my gym or supplement behavior if I knew it had a short-term effect on my fertility. And B4, I would alter my behavior if I knew it had a long-term effect on my fertility. And again, this kind of mirrors somewhat what we saw before, only slightly more extreme. So whereas before we had a kind of 50-50 men had thought about their fertility or not, now the vast majority have never thought about the consequences of gym routines and supplements. But if we go to changing their behavior, if we know about long-term effects, the vast majority would change their behavior. Again, it comes back to this thing of if we can get men to think about it, then they've got a strong desire to do things if there are problems there that they need to do to make changes about. So really, we really need to start bringing these men into the conversation and start getting to them and helping them understand what may or may not have these short and long-term effects on their fertility. We're clearly not in teaching, particularly in the UK, managing to break through, and that's something that I think is probably replicated worldwide in conversations that I've had with people. So just to sum up those survey findings, the awareness surrounding the associations between both exercise and protein supplements is lower in men than in women. Fertility is important to men, but a lot of them don't think about it unprompted. And men don't or haven't naturally considered the impact of gym routines and supplements on their fertility. But if they knew about impacts, they would be willing to change their behavior. And finally, the knowledge of the effects of anabolic steroids on fertility was far greater than for other factors. So moving on to our focus groups. So we just took 2 focus groups of 5 people. So one group of 5 men, one group of 5 women, and gave them an hour of semi-structured interviews with some set discussion topics to really try and understand on a kind of more personal level what their views around this subject were. We did a thematic analysis with the conversations that were had in these focus groups transcribed and encoded as related to 1 or 2 sets of codes, so healthcare communication or reproductive health. So these are the results. We had 5 themes overall, either relating to healthcare communications, so use of the internet and family, friends, women in particular for reproductive health information, and need for engaging, trustworthy and accessible social media healthcare information. And then 3 about reproductive health. So female dominance and reproductive health, lack of consideration and subsequent lack of discussion about male reproductive health, and increased information seeking about male reproductive health discussion as age increases. So taking those one at a time. So in theme 1, what came out from a lot of the discussion was really that female figures were much more prominent in all aspects of healthcare information seeking, rather than going to men or going to peers. So things like the internet as a kind of neutral space was very, very sought after. But after that, people were really thinking they'd go for the female figures. In terms of the female dominance and reproductive health, people said things like, there's a lot of discussion about female fertility, but it's never about the male side of it. So that's a quote from one of our female participants. One of them said, I feel like there are sometimes conversations about reproductive health, but I don't think we've ever had a conversation about male reproductive health. An interesting one that came up was that men felt that they don't ever have to think about their fertility, whereas if you're a woman, then you have this reminder every month with your periods being an indicator of fertility. So that's an interesting thing, that kind of men almost feel isolated from any of the discussion about fertility at all, and then it's all focused on the woman. So there's some interesting things that potentially educationally can be done there. For theme 3, a lot of the group participants felt that social media channels, these were mostly young people, were an engaging form of healthcare communication. But actually, there's a lack of trust surrounding the accuracy of the information, which is interesting. And individuals don't necessarily trust stuff on social media. They're more wary of the things they're being shown. So any sort of education that comes through those sorts of channels has to be really done in the right way, with backed up by references and backed up by proper science for them to believe in it. And really, it was clear among all the groups that they'd never really thought about male reproductive health. One of the men highlighted, the only thing, quote, I've researched infertility is cycling. So they once heard that cycling had a high incidence of infertility in men. And this taboo nature and lack of discussion around male reproductive health is something that all focus groups kind of agreed and shared in, with people saying, we don't talk about private things like that. So there's definitely a more taboo nature of fertility when it comes to men. And perhaps unsurprisingly, a lot of the men we talked to were basically saying, oh, we'll think about it in 10 years' time. Actually, at the moment, we're young, we want to be buff and using the gym, and that's the thing we care about. But we would be prepared to make a lot to make sure that they had the best chance of a child later in life, both for themselves and their partner, if that's what their partner wanted. So there's some interesting findings there. So just to wrap up the things that we found in this study then, the work has shown a significant lack of awareness and information out there actually surrounding the effects of gym lifestyle on male infertility. And we focused on just a UK young adult population, quite an educated population. These were mostly university goers. So actually you would expect them to be more aware really in a lot of these things than the general populace. So that's interesting. Crucially, but perhaps unsurprisingly, awareness differs really significantly between men and women. And really, we found that men have a potentially alarming lack of concern over their own fertility and how factors such as supplementation can have long-term impacts. So just to wrap up there, it's been great talking to you. Here are all the references that I promised. And obviously special acknowledgement, as I said, to Alice, who carried out the bulk of the work, and our collaborations with Jackson Cook and Brown at Birmingham as well.
Yes, thank you for that, Meurig. Just a really fascinating presentation, very well laid out, and particularly that you highlighted that the concern for fertility was there, but perhaps not the awareness. And I think also interesting is that we take something like exercise, which we would be considering beneficial, wholly beneficial, adding in the impact that, okay, we do know that anabolics are going to impact things. That awareness, I think, is more common. But the majority of gym goers, as you highlighted, are probably using some type of additional supplementation, whether it's protein, frequent pre-workout drinks, energy drinks, all of these things that are not regulated. So how do we help to bring awareness to that midline so that we can keep the benefits of exercise, but also allow these men to feel more, empowered in making decisions on their fertility earlier on?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, I think you're really right to bring up energy drinks, because that's another thing that's had a very similar huge spike in the amount of people taking them. And again, they can't be good for all the same reasons, really. If you're messing with your endocrine system, you're going to be potentially having problems down the line. I mean, I think, as you know, it's not just me that would say this. I think there are a lot of groups out there making a lot of noise about how we need wider targeted educational interventions to bring men into the fertility conversation. And really, we need to be really banging on this drum about the fact that male fertility is a female reproductive issue as well. It's all about bringing people together to make them all feel included. And it's not just about lifestyle factors. It's not just about gymming. It's not just about doing these things. It's actually, even in your day-to-day IVF cycles, when you're in the lab, lots of men don't feel included in those processes. And that can't be good for anyone, really. So I do think there's a lot of educational interventions that are needed. I know people like the Male Reproductive Health Initiative are really trying to do a lot of that, and some of it is starting to get information. Things like this tonight, there's a lot of people here who will go home and share these sorts of messages. So I think I would just urge everyone here to kind of keep banging the drum, and especially banging the drum about sperm are cool, not something weird to be uncomfortable about.
Yes, I think as professionals also, all that you mentioned is very important for us to consider. Embryologists, practitioners as well. A lot of times with ICSI and things that we're doing, that process gets bypassed. If we have sperm, we're good to go. And I think it's very interesting the way that you presented that, and really are advocating for the awareness for males as well. So with that, we are going to go ahead and present our next speaker, and that is Dr. Ifigeneia Giannopoulou, a senior lecturer of exercise nutrition and health sciences at the University of Brighton. She is an expert reviewer for the European Commission Horizon 2020 and editorial member in various nutrition and exercise peer-reviewed journals. Her research focuses on the effects of exercise and nutrition on metabolic, hormonal, and energy expenditure disturbances. Ifigeneia, thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation again, and thank you for the attendance in this talk. So I'm going to be focusing on a specific condition which is very common in athletes, and particularly athletes in endurance sports as well as extreme sports. And this condition is called relative energy deficiency in sport, or REDS. I'm going to give you a bit of background on its underlying physiological causes, and then I'm going to proceed with some more specific symptomatology and some recommendations. So we know that nutrition is very important for athletes, both for the health and the performance. And we know that a balanced nutritional program that has sufficient provision of energy, first of all, kilocalories, right, as well as macro and micronutrients and water, can really be very, very important and pivotal, both for the health, the immune function, the fertility, as we're going to see, and for the performance at the end. However, we know that some sports have very specific challenges, right, and particularly in terms of energy. And particularly when we talk about endurance or ultra-endurance sports, as well as extreme sports, such as in the cold or in the heat, we can find a mismatch between the energy needs of the sport and the energy intake that the athletes are consuming from the diet. And that can lead to problems with energy balance and, in reality, energy deficiency, with macronutrient deficiencies such as carbohydrates and proteins, as well as micronutrient deficiencies and dehydration, with significant effects on the health and the performance of the athletes. And yes, we're talking about how much do we consume versus how much we expend. It is a pretty easy equation to think about it, but it has a lot of complexities when it's being dysregulated. And particularly in the athletic field, we talk a lot about energy availability, which has a lot to do with, of course, the energy intake, in contrast to the energy expenditure of the specific event or the specific training program, and always taking into account the fat-free mass, talking about the muscle mass here, right, the lean tissue of the athletes, which we know that it's pretty upregulated and high in athletic populations and can increase the energy expenditure. So what happens when we have this imbalance between energy intake and energy expenditure, and particularly when we have a negative energy balance? We're talking about low energy availability. The athletes are not consuming sufficient energy to support the underlying physiological functioning of the human body for everyday activities, but most importantly for exercise and especially extreme training. And in these cases, as we're going to see, we see a lot of adverse effects, both in physical health and in mental health, and for our case, for this presentation, in fertility, with dysfunctions in the endocrine system and the reproductive system. When we look into energy availability, the optimal energy availability is for an athlete to consume about 45 calories or more for every kilo of the fat-free mass tissue, of the lean tissue, per day. Unfortunately, when this intake is reduced below 45, and particularly below 30 kilocalories per kilo of fat-free mass per day, that's when we start seeing problems. And back in 2012, Lux, one of the major researchers in this field, looked at runners, endurance runners, and they found that in men at that time, partly because not a lot of men were being, studied and diagnosed for conditions like that, the energy availability was fine, about 45 kilocalories per kilo of fat-free mass per day. However, in the amenorrheic women on the right-hand side of the slide with the black circles, we can see that they're below the threshold of 30. And very interestingly, in the eumenorrheic athletes, runners, the female runners, the values could range from normal to below. And that's one of the issues, that we don't always see an evident menstrual dysfunction, despite the problem of low energy availability, which has other manifestations, as we're going to see. So we can't just rely on the menstrual dysfunction. There are other indicators that we need to be aware of. In terms of the prevalence, we know that females have a really high prevalence, depending on the sport, ranging between 22 to 60%. In males, we have more and more evidence coming up in the literature, looking at an evidence of up to 70% if we're talking about ultra-endurance triathletes and extreme sports events. We're looking traditionally at the weight-sensitive aesthetic sports and the weight category sports, such as, judo or boxing. And those were the prevalent problems and the prevalent sports that we used to see LEA. However, more recently, we're looking at a high prevalence in endurance athletes and ultra-endurance sports, as well as extreme sports, for example, in high altitude skiing, in cold or warm extreme temperatures. And the key indicators that are really evident that there is a problem, of course, is the reproductive dysfunction, as we're going to see. What are the predisposing factors of LEA that underlies these conditions? It is the excessive energy expenditure from the sports. We're talking about long-distance sports or ultra-endurance sports that we have really a high kilocalorie expenditure, but at the same time, we might be looking at inadequate energy intake, either voluntarily, intentional, a lot of times, unfortunately, due to a disordered eating or restrained eating condition, or even a clinical eating disorder, and unintentional a lot of times due to stress or lifestyle or traveling of the athlete. And a lot of times we have these two conditions together coinciding, which of course will make the condition much more challenging for the athlete. At the same time, we have the environment, right, the performance environment in terms of the volume and the intensity of training, as well as the actual environment where the athletes are performing it. It is a very complex condition, and the etiology, it's multidisciplinary. Of course, we have the problem of the high volume of training and the inadequate energy that the athletes are consuming, but we have the underlying also mental health issues, potentially, and the pressures as well. So we very often see behavioral and mental health problems with body image, such as body dysmorphia, as well as disordered eating or eating disorders that can actually make the problem even more complicated and more difficult to treat. In terms of the pathophysiology, and I'm gonna spend a few slides here because it's important to understand what's happening physiologically in the human body under this condition. The pathophysiology, again, is pretty complex. We're seeing a homeostatic and balancing adaptation to this chronic negative energy balance, chronically eating less. And we call it, we refer to it as a trade-off, an energetic trade-off, where the body will choose metabolically to adapt to save the fuel for the brain, for example, for the cardiovascular system, and cut out energy from any growth, if we're talking about young female, for example, or male athletes, and from the reproductive system. And this reproductive system suppression that takes place, it is for energy conservation. However, it's very deleterious and can have a lot of course, problems, can cause a lot of problems in the health of the athletes. This slide shows a bit all the magnitude of the problem, starting from this energy and negative energy balance, moving down to the high performance environment exposure, that together, these two parameters cause an array of problems, psychological problems, behavioral problems, but at the same time, physiological problems. And in our case, a hormonal disruption. We're gonna look at that in a second. And these conditions all together can affect, of course, the physical health of the participant, the psychological health, but specifically in our case, the reproductive health. And that's where we see menstrual dysfunction and specific conditions with amenorrhea in females and hypogonadism in males. This is the normal hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. This is what drives, right, the reproductive system. For females on the left, where the hypothalamus stimulates the production of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, and that stimulates the production of LH and FSH in both males and females. It's pretty similar. For females, it will stimulate the ovaries and the production of estrogen and progesterone, while the males, the testosterone. And that has a negative and a positive feedback loop in order to control, regulate the menstrual cycle for the females, the testosterone production for the males, and the reproductive system. However, with LEA, with this chronic condition of low energy availability, we see a functional hypothalamic amenorrhea or oligomenorrhea, which is a step before amenorrhea, and for men, hypogonadism. Specifically, for the females, we have some significant alterations which make the main cause of secondary amenorrhea. It's not the primary reasons due to other disturbances, but it is due to this hypothalamic dysfunction. We see the depression of the axis, and we see an array of hormonal disturbances, which are also biomarkers and indicators that we can test in the lab to have a better assessment of this condition. So we're looking at reduced levels of estradiol, insulin, and insulin-like growth factor, T3 levels, and an increased level of cortisol, a stress hormone. This, of course, coincides, and we call it athletic amenorrhea, and it has been shown that it can be up to 50% of women exercising regularly, and it might not be as clear as, with the symptoms of amenorrhea having a complete loss of the menses, and 30% of the women will present, the full syndrome of amenorrhea. And it can be weight loss related, it can be stress related, and of course it can be exercise related. And in the endurance athletes and the ultramarathon and ultra endurance sports and extreme sports, a lot of times all three types coincide. So we're talking about a very complex condition. In terms of fertility, of course, this can lead to anovulation and hypoestrogenism. It can cause atrophic changes in the genital mucosa, in the uterine muscles, infertility, of course, or even low possibility of spontaneous pregnancy. And if pregnancy occurs, we have a very high risk of miscarriage or preterm labor. And we have to think of the young athletes, which if they start with a delay in menarche because of the high training volume and the low energy intake in contrast to the energy expenditure, if they have a dyschronic puberty and another development of the secondary and the tertiary sex characteristics due to the training volume and the low energy intake, it can in the future develop into infertility. And a lot of times it's irreversible if it's chronic, if it's for a very long period of time. In terms of men, we see an exercise-induced male hypogonadism, which it's really characteristic of the really lower level of basal free and total testosterone, even up to 50% prevalence, a reduction, in the concentrations. We see decreased spermatogenesis or oligospermic conditions, decreased sperm quality, and of course a higher infertility risk. So we're talking about severe and of course lower libido, So we have some severe endocrine and gonadal axis, or in the women, HPC axis disturbances. It's interesting in men, we have more and more evidence, and we're seeing that the years of endurance training can actually make the effects more adverse, although we might see a bit of an adaptation as the athlete is supposedly adapting to that stress. But we still don't have a lot of evidence of that. Overall, it's a messy, if you allow me, situation with a number of systems being affected. This is the point of this graph, to demonstrate the complexity and how multi-disciplinary the approach should be in terms of dealing with these problems. We're seeing hormones from the adipose tissue being affected, insulin levels being affected, the adrenals and the immunity being affected, the thyroid, of course, which can decrease also the metabolic rate of the athletes, apart from other issues, and the bone density of the athletes as well. This LEA underlying condition has been researched, of course, for a number of years, and in females, it has led to the recognition of the female athlete triad. In both genders, the relative energy deficiency in sport, and only in males, the exercise hypogonadal mental male condition. The female athlete triad, again, the underlying cause is the low energy availability with or without an eating disorder, and it can, of course, lead to the menstrual dysfunction that has a spectrum. Over time, it worsens, and it has also a severe effect on osteoporosis and bone mineral density. This is the triad of the females. If we look at males, we sort of discussed that already. We see this hypogonadism as evident from the lower testosterone levels, and it can be an acute transient phenomenon if the athlete managed to recover, if we don't have significant weight loss. But if it's led, untreated for a long period of time, it becomes an adaptation, and that's where we see the hypogonadal male condition occurring, with significant dysfunction in a number of the systems in the human body. That led to the recognition that we do have a male athlete triad, although it was always the female athlete triad we used to discuss, and that is characterized by a lower energy availability below 20 kilocalories for the males. So we seem to have a bit of a different threshold for the males, a low total bone mineral density, a low total testosterone, and a low calculated free testosterone all together coincide in the same time. Recently, we have the recognition of the overall syndrome being called the relative energy deficiency sport, RED-S, that, as you can see, this diagram pretty much, affects every physiological system in the human body, and of course, with a severe effect, in our case, on the reproduction. And that can have severe effects, of course, in other parameters, and of course, the athletes' performance levels. And we have the International Olympic Committee in 2023 to have an update and really talk about not just impaired physiological functioning due to low energy availability, but also impairments in the metabolic rate, in the menstrual function, in the bone health, the immunity of the athletes, protein synthesis for muscle hypertrophy, and cardiovascular health. So we're talking about a very severe condition and really high risk. We're seeing up to 80%, primarily in endurance or ultra endurance or extreme sports prevalence. This, of course, affects performance. I'm going to pass through that slide, but really important to see that mental health is severely impacted on, as well as cognition. So how do we diagnose it? I'm going to pass through the slides very quickly. We need to look at every single criteria of the triad. We need biomarkers of the endocrine disturbances and the metabolic disturbances. In the lab, we measure metabolic rate to look at energy expenditure, and we also have to follow and track the energy expenditure of the athletes. We have a series of questionnaires, which I'm going to leave here, and also the RED-S clinical assessment tool, which is the one that's being used by the International Olympic Committee as well. So I'm going to leave this with you if you want to use this screening tools. And we need, of course, the physical examination, a disorder eating examination, cardiac tests for potential arrhythmias and cardiovascular problems, biochemical tests, and imaging of the pituitary for the most part, and the bone density. In terms of our case, for the endocrine screening, it's really important to exclude that it might be another endocrine problem and to identify which part of the HPA axis is affected, HPC axis is affected. For females, we're looking at FSH, LH, estrogen, testosterone, hormonal levels, and also a pregnancy test in case there is an underlying pregnancy. For female athletes, we need to make the point here that if they're taking oral contraceptive pills, this condition might be masked. So we have to be very careful to make a wrong diagnosis if the athletes are under the oral contraceptive pill. In the males, primarily, we're looking at testosterone and LH concentrations. And of course, we need a full blood count and minerals and vitamins and cortisol for everyone. To finish this presentation, we need a multidisciplinary approach. The first thing we need to do is to increase energy intake and or reduce the energy expenditure. We don't have to reach necessarily immediately the level of 30 or 20 kilocalories per kilo of fat-free mass tissue, but we need to certainly get that negative energy balance taken care of. In terms of menstrual dysfunctions, the most important thing is to increase the body weight and to have adequate protein and carbohydrate consumption. I will agree, not from supplementation, from the actual diet of the individual. And we have also to look at bone density and adequate intake of vitamin D and calcium. Psychological support is almost a must, especially if we have an eating disorder. The first level of recovery will be the energy status in terms of, making sure that the negative energy balance is taken care of, and that will translate into a recovery of the menstrual cycle and status that would take months, depending how chronic the condition is, and later on with a much gradual and more difficult treatment for the bone mineral density. For the IVFs, to conclude here, we need to raise awareness. I will agree with the other speakers. We need to raise awareness. We need to train, I think, the IVF experts to at least conduct a preliminary screening on LEA, and of course collaborate with the rest of the expert team in order to provide a multidisciplinary treatment plan. And you know, it's very important specifically to talk with the athletes and to talk with the coaches, as a lot of times, you know, the interactions between them can be really stressful and actually reduce the chances of a treatment. I would like to thank you for this, for your attendance. This is our team. At the moment, we're running a 6-country study with Australia and the UK and the Mediterranean, looking at LEA in endurance athletes. So we will love some more collaborators for the participation in the study. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Fenia. That was brilliant overview of RED-S and the real issue that it poses for women. And it's something that we see an awful lot of in a huge spectrum. And I think this is why this has been a really important shift away from this concept of the triad that I think a lot of people didn't necessarily fit into because they were in a spectrum of the condition and had falsely reassured in relation to having regular periods. I guess from our perspective, from the clinical side, and it's becoming increasingly common with seeing people on long-term contraception. So the most common one would be the Mirena coil, which as many people have it and will be amenorrheic on it. So it also poses the issue in that we are not identifying issues in relation to the HPA axis and the HPG axis in relation to any issues going on, because actually they may have an underlying raised prolactin or maybe in having RED-S without us knowing. So I guess one of the questions really and to think about from our side is thinking, do you advise really everyone coming off contraception people who are at risk? Because clearly when we're thinking about athletes, it's difficult from a training perspective and people don't want periods because they pose difficulties in being able to fit in training depending on what they're doing. But from a diagnostic perspective, it can clearly help.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. This is a wonderful question, and it's a very tricky question because, yes, athletes, as we know, have very specific personalities. You know, they have, you know, a very specific goal. They've been training for years, and certainly it's not easy to suggest to come off contraceptive pills or, you know, other HRT plans. But certainly we can look at the symptomatology from a number of, you know, different angles. So looking at the basic preliminary, for example, eating disorder examinations, which is one of the underlying, very often behavioral issues that we see in these athletes. At the same time, looking at nutritional status assessment, looking at energy intake versus energy expenditure, which is doable. It's doable certainly to assess, you know, are they potentially at a negative energy balance? And finally, the body weight. The body weight, a lot of these athletes have really low body weight. So in that case, if we look at the symptoms, I think that's when a discussion needs to happen, you know, with the coach and the athletes to potentially come off the pill or come off these contraceptive measures, you know, to assess if there is a problem, because it is affecting performance as well. It's increasing the risk of injury, right? So it is relating back to the performance aspects that they care about.
And I suppose there's one thing to say that ruling out some conditions that could cause amenorrhea, for example, raised prolactin, can still be done in the context of the being on the Mirena coils. It's a good one to screen for. And I suppose not having a strict diagnostic criteria, i.e. having to be amenorrheic to have a diagnosis of RED-S, is important because it allows you not to have to recommend contraceptive discontinuation in order to reach a diagnosis. So it does help to support being able to support more women and men in who are struggling with this.
Certainly, yes.
We could talk all night on this, but I'm going to hand over to Staci just to really bring in Felicity and Pippa into the conversation.
Yeah, so for our next section before Q&A, we are going to learn and discuss more with our panelists, Pippa and Felicity. Panelists, any thoughts today on the topics? Felicity, anything you can bring in relevance to?
Yeah, thanks, Staci, and thanks to everyone for the talks tonight. It's been fascinating to hear the speakers so far. I think some of the things that have been really interesting to share. So I come from a sports nutrition and dietetic background, so understanding the role that low energy availability plays in the development of relative energy deficiency in sport, and actually the context and the environment with which a lot of athletes are operating in. So there are the personal factors, which are, you know, potentially their personality type or their individual body composition and their clinical situation, but understanding the sports system. So what are the measurement practices the coaches are bringing in? What's the athlete understanding? What's the equipment that's being used, the uniform, and all these practices within the sports industry, within the sports system, which can actually be driving factors in pushing some athletes to make choices or to you know, maybe take decisions either intentionally or unintentionally to reduce their energy intake or modify their body composition because of those factors. So in the UK, there was a large-scale review that looked at the sport of gymnastics, and actually a lot of practices from coaching were driving body composition measures in young girls, which were leading to eating disorders and all those sorts of things. So I guess I wanted to kind of bring that topic in because I think it's quite an interesting one to think about from the sports system perspective, and there's considerations outside of the individual when it comes to the energy availability situation.
Definitely. I was a gymnast for many years in my childhood, highly competitive, and we were weighed every Tuesday. And a lot of this became, as you said, the environment of the sport. This was something that was normal for us. It was something that our coaches did. Even at 13, 14 years old, we were aware of our weight. We were advised to eat a little less or eat a little more. And as someone that practiced in the sport, you would sometimes see a difference, you know, when you took your coach's advice, but then it becomes, when is it no longer the environment of the sport, and when does it actually cross over to becoming something disordered? And it's a very fine line, especially considering gymnasts who are very young and impressionable and are definitely not thinking about the long-term impact of this. They're just thinking about next Tuesday when they have to get on the scale. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think similar to the discussion about university students, like a lot of athletes, you know, in their late teens, early 20s, and maybe not considering their reproductive health like in the here and now, but obviously those long-term impacts are going to be felt when we see such high prevalence of this issue and the multi-systemic and huge kind of impact across the systems that is felt by energy deficiency.
Yes, and it becomes very personal to the athlete as well, because your mindset, you're just trained to push through. So I could see that there would be many athletes that might be experiencing certain things, but it's just not something that you may even feel comfortable to address because your goal and your focus is elsewhere and is on sport as compared to the non-environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think and that's where what we tend to see is athletes that might present with frequent bone stress or bone injuries, suboptimal performance. So despite sort of training as hard as they thought they possibly could, they're not achieving their goals, or definitely not achieving those consistently. So erratic performances and not being able to pull together kind of a whole season. And then obviously the psychological effects and maybe those consequences will present themselves initially. So when we're working in the Olympic and Paralympic setting, those can be some of the things that start to kind of flag for us. But obviously we do use screening tools, and they can have their place. And some of the ones that Fenya mentioned on her previous slide were was what I would direct to, but it's a very much addressing the kind of the individual circumstances and understanding, is this an intentional or an unintentional energy deficit? Because like a lot of athletes sometimes don't have the skills or nutritional knowledge to actually fuel the energy deficit, and it's a completely unintentional deficit that's created. So yeah, we treat those on a kind of an individual basis, and I think, yeah, I see Pippa's joined in, so she can really bring an athlete perspective to that to that discussion.
Hi, yeah, certainly. And actually, I was just thinking, Fenia did a great job of highlighting the pervasiveness of this issue in the sporting population, but we've come a long way in terms of increasing the inclusivity of this condition from just athletes within the female athlete triad to sports people within relative energy deficiency in sport. But when I work in my day-to-day practice, which is helping anyone and everyone overcome this condition, I'm seeing more and more regular gym goers or regular exercisers, people who might not necessarily define themselves as athletes or sports people. And so I think it's becoming more and more important to be mindful of the fact this is such a prevalent problem within every sphere. And I guess one sort of question I have, I know I'm a panelist, but I have a question, and that is, when it comes to fertility, at what point are we starting to suggest interventions before looking at someone's overall energy balance? Is that one of the first things that we're looking at, or are we suggesting interventions before that?
I guess maybe I could jump in with this question. I think it's there are, from an NHS perspective, criteria for funding for specific fertility treatment that do have a lower limit of BMI, but it's certainly, people don't weigh people who are very, very light, and it's that everyone has in their mind what the upper limit of BMI is for restrictions for treatment, but there isn't the same focus on the impact of the fact that actually they may be having functional amenorrhea, and we're actually facilitating them from a subfertility perspective and treating them, where this actually could be corrected with dietary adjustment, supportive psychology, in terms of what are their eating habits. So it is definitely, there is awareness there, but I think in practice, and I don't know if you agree, Staci, but it isn't necessarily the same degree of focus or enforcement.
No, exactly. I believe that there are certain practices in IVF in the United States are starting to make a shift into offering things like nutritionists and other types of holistic, so focusing more on the overall health before we go to IVF to get the patient pregnant. And I do see in certain scenarios, I worked at a practice very similar to that for many years, and a lot of the patients would end up getting pregnant on their own once they started the intervention. And then obviously, I don't think there's any negative impact to helping people learn more about their nutrition and about what's actually going on in their body. And that in itself can help them have a healthier baby. So I definitely think that there is an awareness, especially in fertility, where we need to, not only look at the current state, but look at how we can help our patients to actually live better and be healthier and have healthier children and babies, and not just making the goal of just getting them pregnant right then and there as they are. So
I think that's a brilliant comment, Staci, and the one that's brought up in the Q&A about nutrition in pregnancy. And we know that some women and men, but particularly women, because it's going to have an impact on fetal development, who carry these disordered eating patterns that then can translate into restrictive eating patterns in pregnancy because of this change that happens, which is physiological and normal, but can be quite difficult for women to cope with. And we can be at risk of having difficulties in relation to fetal growth and the impact of restrictive eating. So it's clearly not just related to subfertility, but beyond.
Exactly. Agreed.
I think you're on mute, Lyndon.
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah. I was going to say it's probably a good time to move on to Q&A. So we're going to do around about 15 minutes of Q&A, asking questions to Shaun, Meurig and Fenia, and also bringing Felicity and Pippa into the conversation. So I'll start off with a question to Shaun, if I may, and that's regarding women and endurance. There's certainly a perception, or we hear that women are better at endurance activities or better in endurance environments due to what we consider to be the estrogen effect. I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a number of reasons why we see that, and you see that in long distance swimming. A number of long distance racing, there's a more of a balance between male and female performance, and more women winning long distance events than you would find in shorter distance events. So in the first instance, we have to look at the difference in types of muscles that they have. So men have more muscle fibers that are related to explosive power. Then women have a propensity to have slower twitch muscles that are more associated with endurance. My wife always tells me that women have better pain receptors, and that should also be considered in challenging situations and endurance situations. Better at pacing is also something that he said. But as Jen was talking about earlier, the ability for that estrogen effect is women are better at burning fat for fuel, which is more efficient, and then also leaving those carbs in the bloodstream for use and utilization when men will tire.
Felicity, do you want to add? So I was just thinking you looked like you're going to go ahead.
I was just going to say, I guess depending if their estrogen spikes in their menstrual cycle and hormonal responses are functioning as they should be.
Yeah, that's
they're not suffering through relative
yeah.
energy deficiency, which Jen could probably talk more about.
I think they do. So I think it's interesting with the shift in the army, and that women are going to the front line, and they are having a huge amount of focus on that, which I think is fantastic from a medical research perspective, but also they've got these really unique cohorts of individuals that are going through quite difficult training programs, both men and women, and how it's different in terms of energy use, but also particularly looking at endocrine profiles and how those change. And I think we will see more research coming out of the army in relation to subfertility and fertility outcomes as time goes on, is that people will have more period of time in terms of data. But I think we are different physiologically, men and women. I think it's about acknowledging that not everything, there is no one size fits all for everybody. And I think it is about supporting the individual in that specific situation, but just being aware that a lot of the research previously has been done in men, particularly in relation to glucose control, and there hasn't been a huge amount of work in terms of menstrual cycle and performance and how that changes things. So I think it's an exciting time for this area.
Definitely. And on to next question is for Dr. Gallagher. And this is from Sharon, and she is interested in knowing how long after stopping supplements did the small study see improved semen analysis parameters?
Yeah, I think I might have slightly misspoke when I talked about this. So the study had a range of follow-up. It started at 2 months. I think the longest follow-up they had was something like 18 months with a mean of about 4 months. So it's kind of starting on the quite short time period of really seeing that effect straight away, to the kind of long term as well.
Great. We've got a question from Ghulam Badahoul from the UK, and it was a question for Fenia about, I wonder whether there is a greater use of antioxidants amongst people who have higher metabolic activities, so athletes or people who engage in quite a lot of exercise, and whether or not antioxidants may have an impact or help to maintain tissue health. Do you have any kind of data or any comment on that?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting field. Thank you. And thank you for the question, because as we know, supplementation, is very prominent, amongst athletes and active individuals as well. And in some countries, it's even more, sort of marketing-wise supported. And there is some interesting evidence that actually the antioxidant supplementation can have an opposing effect on immunity, because the oxidative stress that exercise induces is actually a sort of a positive stress, in order to have the adaptations biochemically in terms of muscle hypertrophy, in terms of, carbohydrate and fat oxidation, energy metabolism. And actually the provision of antioxidants can hinder that. We have to be very careful with supplementation, of course, because supplementation can really change the pool and the balance inside the body in terms of the different minerals and vitamins. And when you take specific higher concentrations, be of the ACE, antioxidant vitamins, you can disrupt that balance in the pool. So we always say in sports nutrition, the best supplementation is going to the grocery shop, to be honest. However, if we see athletes that they tend to be low in energy balance, if they tend to not consume enough vegetables and fruits, and there is no solutions, if they're traveling, sometimes it is the case that you might have to provide some minimum supplementation,
I guess from a male subfertility side, that one of the commonest things that's recommended for men who have some abnormalities identified on a semen analysis would be to recommend antioxidants. So I suppose it's you're perhaps solving one problem, although the evidence is often conflicted, but you are not improving another. So it's all this fine balance between what is the right thing to do, but we often are faced with what else can we suggest apart from lifestyle optimization, and which is often quite difficult for people, although it's silly as it sounds.
Yeah, and I mean, nutritional education, it's a major issue in athletes still. I was an athlete, we didn't have an education. Supposedly it's been improving, but we still hear athletes that they don't have a sports nutritionist despite the high level of competition. So, it is an issue.
And I think from an antioxidant perspective, the number of products available on the market has expanded latterly. There has been much more sort of availability in this area. But coming back to your point that about the food first, the best supplement being the grocery store, and thinking about what are the whole grains of fruits and vegetables, the herbs and the spices, and the options that individuals can incorporate into their life, is going to massively improve their antioxidant intake far, and do that consistently, far beyond what a supplement would be able to do.
Yeah.
Another question, I guess for Shaun, but also perhaps Felicity and Pippa may have a view on this. This was a question from Francesca Stein regarding aesthetic procedures, and whether things like Botox or fillers could potentially have an impact on female fertility.
I'm not well versed on publications or the literature on Botox, and it's I find it difficult to comment because the standard, I'm sure you've been in the same situation, including Lyndon and most of us here on the panel, in an IVF setting. If we're confronted with a lady who is going for egg freezing or IVF, the advice is always stop any Botox treatments. So I'm not, it has been shown, Botox has been shown to be medically safe, approved by the FDA, given the CE mark as such. So we can say there is an element of safety, but you'd always want to err on the side of caution in an IVF setting. And it'd be very interesting to see the data in around 10 years' time to get an idea of where we are and whether there is any evidence or any suggestion that there is an issue with Botox use. I wonder if anyone else in the panel can pitch in and give their experience and knowledge.
I'm afraid I can't, but it's an interesting question.
I think the thing is there's lots of evidence that you can absorb things topically through the skin. I mean, it is local use, but there are certain things. Another question that's come up in the Q&A about exposure via the skin in terms of makeup, face masks, which contain some agents that you wouldn't necessarily recommend in someone who is trying to conceive or is pregnant. But I think generally speaking, for something that is not medically indicated, so there are some medical indications for Botox where you could justify it on the basis of a medical reason. I think otherwise, in the absence of harm, but in the absence of evidence, the advice really should be that we would advise against it. The time frame for which you should not use it is, it has a relatively short half-life in the context of people using it. So I think generally we probably can't support or say it's not harmful without the evidence there that I'm aware of. Yeah, go for it, Staci.
This question again is for Meurig, and it's from Kristen. And she was asking, which I think also takes a little bit out of the athlete perspective, but if there is a recommendation to make for young men, I know your study was a university age, but I think also we're seeing a lot of men, high school even, involved in sports, consuming things like supplements, pre-workout, creatine, and if this is advisable to tell them to avoid it altogether, is there a way or a resource to safely source these things for young males, because they're most likely not concerned about their fertility at that age?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's really, really tricky because of how little good quality studies there has been done on any of this. I mean, even before you start thinking about supplements, about how anything affects sperm quality generally, there are so little studies with good quality assessments. So it's quite hard to make any sort of recommendations beyond the stuff that we know about basic improvement of lifestyle. So eat well. I mean, the message that's been going around about eating food, good quality real food rather than supplementation. People don't generally need these high amounts of protein, to access to the levels of which you're getting in these supplements. It's not something that is actually needed to have effects of being fit and healthy and going about your daily life. So I think that's the main advice I'd give.
Should I just jump in on the supplement comment? So we would recommend that, first of all, any individual considering supplementation considers what's the need, what's the risk, and then what's the consequences. So what is the deficiency they're trying to correct? What do they believe is the need that they are trying to address? What are the risks? So we know a lot of supplements are contaminated. So a 2017 study showed that at least 10% of supplements on the European market are contaminated with banned steroids, stimulants, heavy metals. There's a lot of nasty stuff out there. So what are the risks of ingesting those sorts of things? And then what are the consequences, whether that's on a ban in your athletic career or the cost in your wallet? So that's what the framework we use when we discuss supplements, and we direct athletes to batch testing services such as Inform Sport, which is available globally, and they have a risk reduction scheme. So if somebody is looking for a safer quality, but there's no guarantee, it's 100% safe, that's the system that we use.
I think it would be also important to consider the reason why you're taking the supplement, and if it's going to be effective, and the level of effectiveness, if it's actually going to increase your performance or not. If these are highly unregulated to begin with, then there's probably not a lot of studies that can actually show that it's going to improve much. And I agree with the point of looking at diet and what you're eating and your nutrition, and prioritizing that first, especially for probably the younger group.
And I think also, if I may say, specifically to protein, because there is that myth still, after years and years of knowledge in nutrition and in the research field as well, in application, that protein, the more protein we get, the better it is, and it's not. And protein has a lot of nitrogen, so I think we need to educate the athletes that nitrogen is excreted, and you lose also a lot of calcium. And if we're talking about amenorrheic women or men with low bone density because of the low body weight and endurance, ultra endurance athletes, that will have a severe effect, on bone injuries and bone health in the future. So certainly we have to be very careful. It's not the more we get, the best it is. And as you said, education about the meal times, protein consumption, how we consume it before, after exercise, the time window that we have for protein synthesis. This can be much more efficient, in increasing muscle hypertrophy and having, positive adaptations to training. We know a lot about protein. I think it's more about education at this point than supplements.
I think we could probably go on for another 4 hours discussing all of these really interesting topics. But I think it is 10 o'clock in the UK. So I think we're going to wrap up the session. It's been absolutely brilliant. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I would like to thank everyone who has taken part from all over the world to join us in this, what has been a brilliant, thought-provoking, really relevant session. I'd like to thank my co-hosts Lyndon Miles and Staci Lynn Wyatt, and Pippa, Woolven and Felicity Devey for their really insightful insights into the various issues we discussed. And of course, our speakers, Shaun Rogers, Meurig, Gallagher and Ifigeneia Giannopoulou.
And not forgetting the I3 team, thanks to the organizing committee of this initiative, I3, who are Jacques Cohen, Peter Naj, Marianne Civetes, Thomas Elliott, Fran Farley, Violetta Suara, and Giles. Thank you all.
So thank you all for tuning in. It has been a very global audience tonight. Thank you for that. Please do continue to come up with great ideas for future webinars. If anyone wishes to support I3 or send more interesting topics, we'd be very grateful. The next webinar is going to be sponsored by Future Fertility with some more information to come, but I think there's going to be some focus there on oocyte and ovarian cryopreservation. So thank you all for attending, and as just stated, it's getting late in Europe, so good night to all of our European colleagues. Good afternoon to our American colleagues, and for our Australian colleagues, I hope you all have a good morning and a good day. So thank you for all attending, and we'll speak to you soon. Take care.